Alright tubes, got something pretty interesting here for you today. We're going to be working on my '06 Ford Ranger again. And what the project at hand is today is we're going to replace this lower control arm. Now there's really nothing wrong with the actual factory control arm, but the reason I've opted to replace the whole thing as opposed to just the ball joint, which is the only part that actually needs to be serviced, is that the factory control arm has a ball joint in it that isn't really removable. I'm sure you could get it out if you tried hard enough, but the majority of the aftermarket ball joints on the market don't fit the stock control arm anyway, so that's why I opted to just go ahead and get the whole thing and replace it. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're just going to get our wheels loosened up. I always loosen up the lugs before I jack the vehicle up because I don't always use an impact gun. And then we can jack the car up and then take our wheels the rest of the way off. Next thing we're going to do is we got a 15mm wrench on this bolt that goes through the steering knuckle, and what that bolt does is that's what actually keeps the ball joint inside of the steering knuckle. So all we're going to do is loosen that up and take it out. Alright, so now as you can see here, I've got the nut off of that bolt. However, the bolt doesn't really want to come out right now. I'm sure if I hit it with a hammer it would come out, but it should come out relatively easily. Now the reason it's pretty tight right now is the way I've got the truck jacked up. As you can see, I've jacked it up from a point that's on the frame and not under the lower control arm. Now the result of that is that the whole control arm, knuckle, front end steering assembly kind of just droops downward, and it's that steep angle that's keeping this ball joint kind of locked into there. So what I'm going to do now is, you can see I've got my safety jack stand sitting under this jack point, so I'm going to let the jack down a little bit, and what that should do is that should bring our whole thing up and make the control arm a little bit more level with the ground, and that should make that bolt a lot easier to get out. Alright, now if we take a hammer to our bolt here, it should pop out quite easily. Sometimes you have to spin them a little bit to get them out. And there she goes. Now as you may have noticed there, our control arm is actually pretty much ready to pop out now. So I'm going to see, yeah, should be able to get it completely out there. Alright, so now what we just have to watch out for is now our whole steering knuckle can kind of freely rotate on the lower control arm, and so what we got to make sure doesn't happen is that it'll fall outward and either pull on this anti-lock brake sensor line, or worse, pull on this brake line. So I'm going to get a little bungee cord or wire or something so we can hold this thing in place while we keep working. Alright, so our next step here is just going to be removal of the two bolts that hold the upper control arm in. You have one on this side and one on this side, and each one has a 21mm nut on the outside. And on this particular truck there's actually a keeper on the bolt, I believe, so we shouldn't need to get a wrench or socket on that side. We should be able to just put our socket on the nut on the outside and remove it relatively easily. I'm going to go ahead and spray them down with a little Aerocoil. That's my penetrating oil of choice. It's a bit on the pricey side, but in my opinion nothing beats it. So I'll put a link down into the description if any guys are interested in this stuff. I had a little bit of difficulty getting that second bolt out, and the reason being is that this fuel line comes up right here, and it's got a little holder that attaches it to the shock tower there, and so it was sort of in the way of the path of the bolt, but there was enough play in it that I was able to just push it out of the way and get the bolt out. Now one thing we want to be aware of is there's this piece on the back here, and I believe that helps out with your alignment, so we're going to just try and leave that untouched there and not remove it. It's a little bit loose and it could come out if we wanted it to, but we're just going to keep it in place exactly where it's at. So at this point in time there should be absolutely nothing holding this control arm in, and we should be able to pretty much just pull it right out, like so. So here's our old stacked up on top of the new there, and it looks pretty symmetrical, so I'd say we got the right part which is a good thing. It's always good to check that because you never know. Sometimes they send you the wrong one, or they send you the right side or the left side, because they are different. So fortunately we got the right one, so we can go ahead and install this new one. Now the installation here will pretty much be just the exact opposite of the installation. One thing you may find though is that since this control arm has brand new bushings in it, it may be a little bit more difficult to install than it was to take out the old one. It'll probably just require a little bit of finesse to get it in. There we go. I think we got it. Alright, so I got both of our bolts in, and as I was saying, it's really just a matter of finesse and jiggling things around until you get everything lined up and get the bolts in. But what I decided I would show you guys is one of these shims ended up coming out. Actually, they both ended up coming out. So I figured I would just do a quick segment on these just so you guys know what's going on with them in case you end up having one fall out and you don't get confused with it. The deal with these is these are pretty much how, well, or at least part of how your alignment is set up. And the way they work is just you have this shim here with this hole in a particular location. And what the shim does is it just fits in between two slots up in here. So the shim itself can't move anywhere. So once it's up in there, it's wherever it's at. So if you want to change your alignment, what you do is you get a different one of these that has that hole in a different spot. And that's pretty much how it's done. So what you just want to be mindful of is if this falls out, just try and put it in the way it came. And the way they come is just with the these angled spots. That goes towards the top, and this little ring here goes towards the inside. So just keep that in mind and you shouldn't have any problems. Oh, and one other thing to be aware of is just you got to make sure that this thing is actually sitting where it's supposed to up in between here, because this mount here where the bolt goes through actually has a slot in it, and that's why you can get different shims here with the hole in a different spot. So that's where your position is fixed, and then in here there's actually slots so it could go back and forth in there. So what you want to make sure of is that this is actually sitting flush against the mount there in between the two grooves that keep this in place. Now what I like to do is once I'm sure that those shims are in there correctly, I'll take the bolt and I'll put it down snug so that way I'm sure the shim isn't going to pop out from between the grooves. But I won't tighten it down all the way, and the reason for that is it leaves you a little bit of extra play in here. It's a little bit easier to move it without them being totally tightened down, and that'll just make it a little bit easier to put it back together. Now we're just about ready to reinsert the ball joint into the knuckle, but before I do that, I'm going to put a little bit of anti-seize on this ball joint. That way if I ever got to take this apart, or anybody else has to take this apart, it'll be a lot easier to do so. This is just standard Permatex anti-seize. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. I used to never use anti-seize, but the more I work on things and I encounter parts that have not had anti-seize put on them before they were assembled, the more I realize how good it is to use it. So if you take a look at the ball joint here, you can see this little groove in here. That's where that keeper bolt actually slides through. So the control arm itself in the ball joint actually goes pretty deep into the actual knuckle. Pretty much the way we get it together here is really nothing fancy, just a matter of working it in. Like so. As you can see, it just takes a little bit of tapping to get it in there, but if everything's lined up, it really shouldn't need that much hammering to get it to go in. But the way you can tell you got it all the way is if your bolt goes in like that, it slips right in. And if we try to pull our control arm out, you can see it doesn't come out because that bolt's keeping it in there. So we'll just tighten that back up. We'll also make sure that our control arm bolts are tight. And that pretty much completes our job. We'll just go ahead and put our wheel back on, make sure our lugs are all tightened up, jack it up, get our jack stand out of the way, lower the car back down, and double check our lugs, and that'll be it. Alright guys, so that's going to do it for this video. It was a pretty simple job and didn't really give me any problems. And hopefully if you guys are trying to do this job, that ends up being the same case for you guys. As always, if you liked the video, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe for more, And if you have any questions, be sure to leave them down in the comments. Alright, thanks for watching.